Everyone to this wonderful event. I am Yonemoto. I'm a religious studies visiting assistant professor at Claremont McKenna College, and I'll be the moderator for today. So thank you all for taking time out to join us for this roundtable here at the Institute for Signifying Scriptures. We're here to discuss this latest book, White Man's Magic, Scripturalization as Slavery, by Dr. Vincent Wimbush, who is the director of the Institute of Signifying Scriptures, and he is a professor of religion at Claremont Graduate University and the author of a couple of books and editor of a couple of texts. He's the author of The Bible and African Americans, A Brief History, and the editor of African Americans and the Bible, Sacred Texts and Social Textures, and the editor of Theorizing Scriptures, a new critical orientations to a cultural phenomena. We're very excited to have the opportunity to have a discussion about this particular book, and I'll tell you the format for today, but before I do that, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First, there are a nice generous spread of refreshments that are available for all of us, so please feel free to help yourself to drinks and some finger foods throughout our gathering today. And the second announcement is that I'm going to pass this clipboard around. If you're new to ISS, we would love to keep in touch with you and ask that you would leave us with your name and contact information so we can notify you of any upcoming events. So when I'm going to pass this around this way. And so the order of our agenda for today to facilitate our discussion, I'll start and begin by introducing our different panelists for today. We do have one colleague who is in flight, who might be joining us a little later in the second half of our program for today. But we will have, after my introductions, each of the panelists will make some formal remarks from the reading of this text, and they've been asked to prepare about 10 to 12 minutes of formal remarks. Thereafter, we'll have about 10 minutes of informal conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open up the discussion to everyone here for another 20 minutes, and we'll conclude with some final remarks by Dr. Wimbush. So with that, why don't I introduce our panelists? Our first panelist with us today is Dr. Valorie Thomas. Dr. Thomas is an associate professor of English and Africana Studies at Pomona College. Her research includes diaspora, literary and cultural theory, indigenous spirituality, vernacular culture and language, Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, and Maya Deren. She is also the writer, co-producer, and co-director of the film Homeland, which was recognized by the National Black Filmmakers Programming Consortium as 1989's Best Short Feature. We also have with us in flight, and he'll join us a little later, Dr. Benny Liew. Dr. Liew is the Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. He is most interested and invested in the transdisciplinary study of Christian scriptures. His published works include What is Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics, Reading the New Testament, and Politics of Parousia, Reading Mark Intercontextually. Dr. Liew also serves on several international editorial boards and is currently the editor of the journal Biblical Interpretation. We also have with us Dr. Robert Hill. Dr. Hill is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's an expert in the field of Afro-American and Caribbean history. He has published extensively on Marcus Garvey, most notably the 12 volumes of the Marcus Garvey and UNIA papers. Dr. Hill is the recipient of many professional awards, including the Gold Musgrave Medal of the Institute of Jamaica for Distinguished Contribution of History, and has a recent appointment as General Editor of the C.L.R. James Archive Series with Duke University Press. And our final panelist is Dr. Ronne Hartfield. Dr. Hartfield is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. Dr. Hartfield is an independent consultant in museum education and planning. Her clients have included the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Rubin Museum of Art in New York City, the Museum of Biblical Art in New York City, as well as museums in Sao Paulo, London, and Kyoto. A prolific essayist, Dr. Hartfield is the author of the critically acclaimed Another Way Home, The Tangled Roots of Race in One Chicago Family. And it's a memoir that tells the story of her mother's journey from a southern plantation to the clamor of New Orleans to the bustle of Chicago's Bronzeville. Again, welcome to all of our panelists and our guests here today. Why don't we turn the table over now to the panelists themselves for our formal remarks. And I'd like to start with, why don't we start with Dr. Valorie Thomas.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to have been invited to participate in this roundtable. And I would start by just congratulating the Center and Vincent on this publication. I have a tendency to sort of go off script, but I'm going to really try to stay on script with the remarks that I wrote. And if I go over, please give me the sign and I'll just stop.
Okay.
All right. We are witness to a moment in which time seems to be standing still while spinning or moving absurdly backward, and Scripture is being, for lack of a better word, hijacked by the lunatic fringe of the political right. In fact, I view it as the recolonization and re-territorializing of Scripture by the willfully distortionist politics of contemporary right-wing interests. Slavery has recently been rewritten as, a quote, a blessing for blacks by the likes of Republican Representative John Hubbard, who also cites Scripture to underwrite his belief that children should be subject to the death penalty and all Muslims should be deported from the U.S. He and others have succeeded in stirring the pot to establish a tempest of debate. Beliefs and systems of belief that translate to institutional policy are much at risk in these deployments of Scripture as handmaiden to white supremacist patriarchy. School boards in a number of states, including Tennessee, are being lobbied to change the historical narrative of race in the U.S. in ways that downplay the problems of racism, violence, and exploitation of those held captive to the caprice of white supremacy. Textbooks are being rewritten to glorify white male histories of enslavement, conquest, and self-invention. The stakes could not be higher. For some, a mind is a wonderful thing to colonize, but what I'm really talking about is a morally and socially disoriented, partially illiterate, and traumatized middle-class mind that in its alienated state of freefall is being directed to reorient through, to borrow a term from Professor Wimbush, scripturalizations of the master race. My belief is that in this moment, we scholars have to do more than serve as passive witnesses. At the minimum, we have to maintain a landscape of historical and literary counter-narratives, refuse conquest of the collective imagination by veiled white supremacists, and we have to act against epistemic violence and the resegregation of knowledge. Which brings me to white men's magic, scripturalization as slavery. I entered this discussion through the following poem, Caliban, by Abina Busia, which for me speaks to what Professor Wimbush identifies as, quote, my beginnings in relationship to the phenomenon of the fraught moments from the 15th through the 19th centuries having to do with the first contact between the West and the worlds of the other. This tongue that I have mastered has mastered me, has taught me curses in the language of the master, has taught me bondage in the language of the master. I speak this dispossession in the language of the master. In this radically new reading and theorizing of the interesting narrative, however, Wimbush demonstrates that Equiano is really no Caliban. Wimbush demonstrates that Equiano positions himself to master and exploit the mobility and shifting spaces, ethnic, social, political, national, and diasporic, that he encounters through language, memory, and the social, institutional, and psychogeographies produced by Scripture. With all the epic complexity of Milton's resistant angel rendered other, Equiano's relationship to scripturalization establishes a habitable margin of agency, a space that registers that he is in diaspora, and diaspora is in him. Wimbush, in other words, has offered readers a distinctively new and nuanced lens on Equiano as stranger and diasporic subject. He's theorizing both Equiano and the processes of scripturalization, while very importantly demonstrating a new set of clearly delineated analyses and accessible transdisciplinary pedagogical strategies for teaching Equiano, early modern and contemporary modes of scripturalization, and tactics that recuperate and revalue Black diasporic vernacular processes. He writes that, quote, the Black struggle for survival, freedom, and acquisition of power are understood by Equiano to turn around awareness of and response to the dominant culture's fetishizing of the book, the Bible. This awareness inspired Equiano to structure his story as a scriptural biblical story that signifies on the very use of scriptures what I here call scripturalization, the social, psychological, political structure establishing its own reality. So I sort of repeat that because I want to underscore that, that there's a new formulation that I think has large implications for us in thinking about scripture and books and the construction of discourse and counter-discourse. Wimbush asserts that Equiano's signifying exemplifies vernacular practice for the sake of resistance, survival, freedom, and independent thriving in complex response to scripturalization as fetishization, white men's magic, practices, arrangements, behaviors, and rhetorics. This move recuperates the vernacular and the tension it creates as mechanisms of critical transformation, spaces of agency, and grounds for intervening on institutionalized rhetorics, narratological strategies, and the shaping of resistant semiospheres, in which Wimbush finds the invention, placement, and valences of separate signs as well as the work of signification. As an example of this analysis, Wimbush argues with respect to Equiano's use of the term influence, a close reading that follows. Equiano's thinking of such a system in terms of a semiosphere is illuminating. His story clearly aims to describe the construction of power in the British world. How could he, a sensitive, creative, and articulate person, involuntarily pushed onto the peripheries of a dominant society, not be interested in fathoming how that larger dominant world worked, how it was structured, but how to think about it, what to call it, and how to hold forth about it? These were the challenges. Using the obviously self-interested imagined culture of the Igbos to think with, an inflection of the English term influence came to mind. And he goes on, influence conveyed world, not merely space or environment, but a discursive space, meaningful space, space in which certain assumptions were made, in which languages and their constitutive units were structured in certain ways. All this you see from a close reading of a word, and importantly, its inflection. The ability to read, translate, and theorize the implications of the signifying inflection goes beyond our conventional understanding of the accent, the accented gaze, and the use of signifying as satirical or ironic upbraiding. Wimbush is very persuasively raising the stakes by delving into the oscillations and tensions that inform the shifting spaces of translation and diasporic double visioning. He suggests provocatively that inflection can be read as disidentification, a signifying relation to the master narrative that redeploys its conventions in order to qualify, open, disrupt, and transform meaning in ways that support subaltern agency. Through this argument, we come to the crucial recognition that even in his flawless mastery and performance of standard English, Equiano is exercising a certain creolized agency that reserves the right to change, weigh multiple interpretations, and critique that which he observes, embraces, and at the same time rejects, or which may be rejecting him. This stance is axiomatic to Morrison's figuration in Beloved of constructing room, what she calls room to imagine. And as Wimbush points out, that room may be nonlinear, circular, the space of a ripped veil, and finding ways of speaking the unspeakable. If it is true that within the jazz-like ethos that Wimbush seeks to create in this critical gesture, Equiano can metonymically provide a way forward into an Ellisonian end that is in the beginning and lies far ahead, he is in part figuring Equiano as a master of an epic, discursive, and semiotic crossroads, a space of epic contingencies. Wimbush illuminates an Equiano who employs scripture as a means of traversing the dislocations of culture, geography, trauma, and transformation. This Equiano is the almost an Englishman who masters assimilation, yet refuses to amputate his claim to agency in the process, and so reserves the right to resist assimilation. We are being shown our own ongoing double and redoubling bind. As he reads Equiano's conversion narrative, Wimbush asserts the possibility of comprehending, quote, dimensions of experience with the text that go beyond the usual dimension of the oral. That's O-R-A-L-A-U-R-A-L. And certainly beyond the printed page. He finds that what is at issue here is Equiano's recording of the dramatic reversal of the non-talking book story. His transformation means he is positioned not merely to read and be read to, speak and be spoken to. He in fact becomes intimate with God, sensible of the invisible hand of God. He thereby becomes like the priests, magicians, and doctors of his people, a powerful calculator of his times, one who had come to possess extraordinary methods of discovery. This is all quote. Equiano effectively, he argues, decontextualizes Christian scriptures that they might be reactivated as scriptures by and for the 18th century black stranger, through whom God is constructing the future. We are here presented with an Equiano who constructs agency through, rather than in spite of, the mobility of diaspora, building on his perception of the mechanisms that construct difference in the early modern era, embracing multiplicity and fragmentation, drawing on the transitions and tensions of a vertiginous social, psychological, cultural landscape, and valuing contingency and conditional space. As a final note, I want to underscore and affirm the importance of memoir in structuring this analysis, which is also identity construction through story. The memoir offered that structures the text is a gesture toward an interstitial subjectivity and methodology that affirms the landscape and particularities of vernacular knowledges and depathologizes those knowledges. Wimbush's identification of Equiano is part of an intellectual writing community, as part of an intellectual writing community or school of like-minded critical African-identified scholars is compelling. That Wimbush sees himself and others of us standing alongside Equiano constitutes an important political and cultural statement by, quote, a son of Africa, in Equiano's sense of that phrase, that remaps the terrain of memory and history, establishes agency, and places the double-voiced storyteller as someone who recalls, remembers, and helps us fathom what time it is. So, I'm done.
Why don't we go around in this clockwise fashion?
Want me to be next?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, I have to get rid of my cough drop. Hope I don't cough my way through this. A couple of things that you said had such resonance for the way that I see Equiano, and I love that you called him double-voiced. And I think he does a lot of doubling. So, first of all, I love this book. And I wrote Vincent a letter talking about the resonance of the book in my personal life, for my personal life, and part of it has to do with this mastery of double voicing and what I call the hegemony of the word, because I was brought up in a family that really prized mastery of the word. And so I titled this little talk, Praise for Equiano's Challenge to the Canonical Center, Logocentrism, Ethnocentrism, and the Hegemony of the Word. Then, encountering such an academically over-the-top title as this, this is a real University of Chicago title, one might justifiably ask in some wonder, what in the world would Equiano say? What indeed would or could be said by this Equiano, this ethnically designated other, who has made it his business to become a logo master in order to dismantle a canonically established hegemony? Are these words that might reside in a talking book? If it were the 21st century instead of the 18th, what he might have said is what contemporary American poet Hakeem Madhubuti, formerly Donnell Lee, says in a poem written for poet laureate Gwendolyn Brooks. And this poem, really, of course, written for the logo master of all time, could just as well have been written about Equiano. This is the quote: "Your ancestry is book country. Able bones crossing the Atlantic Ocean to discover white pages, protein and protege in the Midland. Our ancestry is book country, and rich earth, galloping souls, and skillful deal makers. We are becoming the portrait of your right words. This business of right words is what Equiano was all about. He knew that he needed to learn the right words of the dominant majority, not in order to imitate them, but to invert their assumed hegemonic power, to master the skills that would enable himself to use them for his own ends, on his own terms, in the words of the poet, to make his own deals. That is the magic that constitutes his challenge to the canonical power of the English Bible, and that is the magic appropriated by Vincent Wimbush in his illuminating analysis of white men's magic, Scripturalization as Slavery. I quote briefly from the epilogue. Quote, "There are no white men, there is no magic, there are no books that talk, there are no scriptures, except, as Equiano's story helps us understand, to speak of. That is the point. What is real is the politics and uses of language, the work of the meta-discursive regimes that enslave, that control language use, and the effects of such." This is all Vincent. The discovered regime that was Scripturalization afforded Equiano opportunity and space to perform a self. And that's why I loved your use of that term. Not a fixed self for all time, but for what each moment requires for his survival and thriving. Unhappily, it's just a minor political note I have to make. Our president did not perform his self very well last week. Performing this, he doesn't like performing. He doesn't like performing the self. Performing the self, what a notion. Performing a self. A bit further into this paper, I want to amplify how French cultural critics of the late 20th century brought this question to the forefront of global intellectual discourse. For this moment, we're wanting to examine how Wimbush establishes Equiano as nothing less than a masterful performer. Significantly, tropes of his performance include his explicit self-naming. And you've all seen the book. I wanted to have a slide of the frontispiece, but you've seen it. So you'll hear what I'm saying, and be able to see it in your head. The original 1794 frontispiece of Equiano's autobiography includes two authorial names. This is the doubling. First, in elegantly Victorian cursive, his African name, Olaudah Equiano. And then, just below that, in standard capitals, the slave name, Gustavus Vassa, beneath which appears Equiano's self-description, quote, "the African," in case you didn't know. Once again, in Victorian cursive. This startling and assertive doubling of nomenclature appears prior to any actual engagement with the text. So he's setting this up with the picture. Also appearing contiguous to the title page, subtitled, quote, "The Interesting Narrative of My Life." A subtitle which I absolutely love. I mean, I think that we should all write our books with that as a subtitle. It's accompanied by a compelling, even glamorous photograph of Equiano himself, barbered to the end, and accoutred exquisitely in the style of the period. Now, I work in the visual arts. Employing the tools of visual analysis, Equiano's goals are unmistakable. His photograph presents its subject in an authoritative pose with a subtly haughty expression, eyebrows raised, a faint smile about his lips, a document of some sort held in his right hand completing the picture. There can be little doubt, looking at this picture, that this narrative will indeed be as interesting as its binomial author promises. Wimbush notes the following, quote, Equiano's writing, the very act of his writing, must be seen as a profound response to the British world. Whatever the sources of inspiration or influences on his decision to write his story, evangelical abolitionist group interests and strategies, economic interests, and so forth, Equiano's storytelling is a reflection of awareness of and response to the assumptions of the early modern British and the larger Atlantic engagement of North Atlantic world scripts and books, expressions of ideas and sentiments. Equiano learned to hear the English book talk, and by his learning, to talk back to it and to the world of the book. Equiano made his storytelling a critical, analytical, and political reading of the British world, and by extension the North Atlantic worlds, with this goal, carefully integrating himself into a differently defined and oriented English world. And I think that last line is critical as an underpinning for the book. That is to say, the basic thing Equiano was about was differently defining, differently orienting the English world. This is a wonderful statement, and back to my own paper. This is a wonderful statement about what really is at work here. Equiano's goal is to employ his skills with the meta-narrative to create new definitions, to integrate the realities of his previously African world into the newer English world in which he finds himself, to redetermine its outworn sureties, and thereby reorient this new world to a complex but truthful cultural reality of which that world had been unaware. We must remember that Equiano's intent was to fathom the English world by conquering and subverting their preeminent knowledge of the Bible, by creating comparisons and parallels between the assumptive authority of the British Christian Bible, what Wimbush termed Scripturalization, I can hardly get that word out, and those iconic African power structures within his own knowledge, and unknown to, or not understood by the British, constructed and controlled by the African Igbo people from which he came. Equiano assumes unto himself the challenging task of creating a basis for parity, individual and communal parity, between two radically different worlds. He describes this in somewhat confusing terms as becoming British. When I was first introduced to Equiano in the 1980s, I was teaching African literature, and a number of scholars in the field at the time really disdained Equiano because they read that becoming British as an abdication of his Africanness. This unfortunate phraseology has led some readers to impugn Equiano for valorizing the tenets of whiteness above those of his own racial inheritance. It seems to me that Wimbush's configuration is considerably closer to the actuality of Equiano's task, and indeed of his triumph in appropriating white men's magic. A later and vivid example of what might be termed African scripturalization is seen in the literary work of Chinua Achebe, a brilliant mid-20th century novelist of Nigerian origin. Writing in pellucid English, Achebe produced a series of now widely studied novels designed to illuminate the fundamental rationality inherent in his native Igbo rituals and customs. Using fiction as a vehicle, he obliged the English-speaking literary establishment to confront challenges to their closely held colonialist designations of the primitive, and in so doing, he fundamentally reoriented their hierarchical assumptions by selecting appropriate titles for his first two books. First one called Things Fall Apart, based on the work of William Butler Yeats. The subsequent one, No Longer at Ease, based on the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Both of these poets have been awarded the highest place in the English pantheon. Achebe's Igbo tales thus demonstrate not only a careful scholar's mastery of the poet's original intent, but he has the temerity to add unimagined layers of complexity, what we might term his own particular cultural riff, located in a Nigerian context. Well, finally, a nonfiction scholarly treatise returns us to the perspective of the French linguistic structuralist. Jacques Derrida's thoughts on the subject of canon setting and deconstructing are captured in his idea that the anticipation of any future world can only be proclaimed or presented, in the language you're using here, performed. For it will have put into question the value of sign, word, and writing. And I have some quotes from Derrida that I'm going to leave out in the interest of time. But there are three quotes that affirm the magic of writing from the earliest things that are written down in cuneiform to Hegel. We must be grateful for Equiano's creativity and courage, succeeded by later African writers like Chinua Achebe, because they offer timeless lessons for all of us who must still respond to the challenge of inverting paradigms of what is primitive and what is civilized. In worlds like the one we occupy, stubbornly resistant to change. We're grateful to Vincent Wimbush for putting the story in our hands, for teaching us, for the present and for futures unknown, the real power of black men's magic.
Okay.
Okay, you want me to do that?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you. Let me warn you up front that some of what I'm about to say you will find quite disturbing. So I put you on notice. First, I'd like to thank Professor Wimbush and his remarkable Institute of Signifying Scriptures for this kind invitation. In his classic 1789 autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluwado Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself, the author relates how he experienced the mystery first as a young man of reading. Brother Vassa states, quote, "I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning for that purpose. I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it when alone in hopes that it would answer me, and I have been very much concerned when I found it remain silent." Now, in my view, in this book that we are considering here this evening, Vincent Wimbush's White Men's Magic, Scripturalization of Slavery, what the reader hears is the author, Vincent Wimbush, talking to the interesting narrative of the life of Oluwado Equiano, and making it in turn talk to us. And if, like Brother Vassa, we put our ears to this book, what we hear are an amazing series of answers to the question that is before us, namely, the phenomenology of scripturalization. So let me begin by congratulating Vincent Wimbush and by extension the Institute for Signifying Scriptures, of which he is the founder and director, on the publication of this remarkable text, White Men's Magic. It is, in my opinion, the defining theoretical statement of the Institute's mission and its unique vision of scholarship. As an author myself and a historical editor, and knowing therefore something of what is involved and what it takes to produce such an extraordinary work, I stand frankly in awe of what is a theoretical and theological summa of a major intellectual enterprise. So I would say here to the Institute for Signifying Scriptures, what is in your hands and what is before us this evening is the long-awaited programmatic justification of your work. Congratulations. On a deeper, more personal level, this book is a statement of Vincent Wimbush's, this is how I read it, continuing attempt at self-emancipation. What is so striking is the intellectual boldness of White Men's Magic as an intervention in what is one of the most fraught areas of recent attempts at theorizing culture. Vincent Wimbush's unique approach is to say, let us talk. Let us talk. Something as straightforward, direct, is so profound. How refreshing, how liberating it is to hear these words. Words that say, I am interested in how we talk and how we talk to each other. This sound of Wimbush talking in this text is something that builds and is really quite a remarkable aesthetic feature, if not, for me, the defining aesthetic feature of the book. Now, I can't say that I have absorbed or grasped all that is contained in White Men's Magic. Indeed, it will take anyone a fair amount of time and effort to be able to say so. The fact is that this book lays out a coherent theoretical justification of why the pursuit of signifying scriptures should be undertaken. Now, at the same time, I suspect that we, Professor Wimbush and myself, do have serious differences about the story of Brother Vasa, and also about the methodological route that he has taken to track the interpretation of the book. Still, I welcome the publication of White Men's Magic as truly a gift from an extraordinary practitioner of close textual reading, one that shows not only its strengths and challenges, but also its limitations and its blind spots. Let me cite a few examples. If the approach that is on offer in White Men's Magic provides a kind of programmatic statement, then the question is, can we generalize upon this book? Can we generalize from it? For example, how would you extend its approach beyond Vasa to say, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, 1845, and then what would that book look like after we have subjected it to the treatment of scripturalization? In other words, if we submit Douglas's autobiography under the microscope of scripturalization, what might that reveal? In other words, is this thesis of scripturalization specific only to Equiano, or can it be generalized? Here's another example. In the epilogue, Brother Wimbush reveals that his students experienced a great deal of resistance, and he in turn experienced a great deal of dissonance when he tried to teach this book. He tells us, quote, "Several years ago, I taught a special course that had a close reading of Equiano's narrative as its focus." And then he describes the experience, quote, "As I recall, there were 9 or 10 students in the class. They were all intelligent, mature, and well-traveled, with successful careers in ministry and other domains. They happened to be African Americans all. What stayed with me was the negative reaction to Equiano on the part of almost all of them, with 1 or 2 exceptions. To my astonishment, most students fought him throughout the course. They consistently commented that in their view he was, quote, not really black, close quote, that he did not act, did not signify, quote, black, and so forth. Now, in my view, the instructor, Professor Wimbush, might have benefited from making a greater effort at listening to the negative reactions of his students, and thereby allowing their dissenting views more space to emerge. He chose to interpret their negative reaction as follows, quote, "It was clear to me that these students were no uninformed persons about the history of black peoples or black literatures. They were, in fact, translating and representing a long and thick cultural, ideological, discursive, and theoretical orientation that bordered on a type of essentialism of or cultural political correctness around blackness." What is clear from both sides of the encounter is that for the students, the interesting narrative was by no means scriptural, okay? It was not a scriptural text for the students. Whereas for the instructor, the scripturality of the text was simply taken as a given. So if we are going to talk about scripturalization and Vasa's book, then it seems only fair to ask, scriptural for whom? The audience has to be brought into our interpretation of the scriptural. And in providing an answer, don't we have to specify which audience is doing the scripturalizing? One notable blind spot in the text for me was the absence, which puzzled me. In a book that is so profoundly informed by the concept of supernatural magic and the role of books in performing magic, and one that is preoccupied with the experience of radical alterity, I could not find any reference to the role of the magician Prospero in Shakespeare's final play, The Tempest, along with Prospero's magic books. It was Prospero's preternatural use of European magic that Shakespeare uses to dramatize Prospero's seizure and colonization of the island of Setebos and the enslavement of the Welt Caliban. Given the numerous parallels to the imputation of magic in Shakespeare and in White Men's Magic, and given the powerful elucidation of the tropes of colonial discourse to have emerged between the publication of Manoni's 1960 Prospero and Caliban and Césaire's 1968 adaptation of The Tempest, given this powerful discursive arsenal, why doesn't Brother Wimbush deploy it? In other words, one is left to wonder at the absence of any allusion to the prominence and the role of colonial discourse in this book's formulation of colonial scripturalization. Now, I would venture to say that the students in the class that Brother Wimbush taught, and where the students were so resistant to the text, was that what they were looking for was more Caliban and less Prospero. More Caliban, less Prospero. In the master-slave dialectic to be found in the story recounted by the interesting narrative. Finally, I would like to close these few remarks by affirming that scripturalization will be henceforth a powerful term to conjure with. But having begun by conjuring the idea of scripturalization, Brother Wimbush ends his book with an equally stunning act of abjuration or renunciation. He declares at the last, quote, "I'm now beginning to figure out what for many years was haunting me." Isn't that amazing? At the end of this book, he says, I am beginning to understand what was haunting me all these years. I am beginning to figure out how and what to read and to what ends. And then he says, there are no texts that speak. There are no white men. There is no white man's magic. What was haunting our dear brother, if it was magic, and magic was make-believe, was an act of imposture. And if this conclusion is reached at the end of White Men's Magic, that there are no texts that speak, there are no white men, there is no white man's magic, then we have to infer that the ontology that produced them, out of which they came, the very ontology of make-believe and imitation, tracked so assiduously by Wimbush throughout his text, was always already the ontology of imposture. But Brother Wimbush doesn't say this. So I'm saying it for him. Why is it so difficult for him to say that word, imposture? Is that a bridge, transgressively speaking, too far? Even though he refers at many places throughout the text that he is trying to be transgressive? In other words, would the concept of imposture impugn the object of his study? Let me be very clear. I am not using the concept of imposture to be polemical. I am using it because Brother Vasa was an impostor, a hugely significant and important impostor, as we can agree. He was neither an Igbo nor a South Carolinian slave. Brother Vasa, you see, was a West Indian, and as a West Indian myself, I recognize the type instinctively. He's one of my people. Vasa's critics claim that he was born in what is today
Well, thank you.
St. Croix, and I believe that he was. But whatever the precise details of his birth were, it should be abundantly clear from his book, with its 128 separate references to the islands and to the West Indies, that his political, social, and cultural consciousness was formed and developed in the West Indies. If the West Indies formed the center of what Vasa calls his disgust, it was also where he fought for and won his freedom. When Ian McKenna refers to Vasa as, quote, a West Indian Jacobin in his book, Radical Underworld, Prophets, Revolutionaries, and Pornographers in London, 1795 to 1840, I think Dr. McKenna hits the nail correctly on the head. The book that Vasa attributes to having also been written by himself was, in my view, not exclusively his work. I believe that it was a collective effort, the product of the radical religious and literary underground of Hanoverian London, the same underground that produced Vasa, the political persona. In fact, there are just too many stylistic differences in the writing of the various chapters of the book for the book to have been the product of a single author. It was Vasa's story, but one that could just as easily have been communicated in a variety of forums and ways, but not necessarily written by himself. What I find quite ironic is that for someone who speaks about books that he talked to in his interesting narrative, the interesting narrative includes not a single instance of orality. I repeat that. Here is a person who speaks so movingly about talking to books, but in the text of his quote-unquote book, there is not a single instance that smacks of orality. Compare that, however, to the many and incessant instances of the oral that sustain Brother Wimbush's White Man's Magic. All over that book, page after page, you hear the oral coming through. I believe it is impossible for a black person of the 18th century or any other century to write a book with no trace of the oral in it. If anyone here can point me to an instance of orality in Vasa's interesting narrative, I would welcome it and welcome your sharing it. And this, for me, you see, is a crucial test or proof of whether Vasa actually wrote the book, even if he was in fact the author of the story, and I'm not disputing that. Finally, by today's standards, I suspect that Brother Vassar was gay. Vassar, the French horn-playing hairdresser of Coventry, that speaks about, quote, the dances I gave in my Georgia superfine blue clothes that made no indifferent appearance, and dances where Vassar tells us, quote, some of the sable females who formerly stood aloof now began to relax and appear less coy. But my heart was still fixed on London, where I hope to be ere long. Why is Vassar so coy about his lady friends who begin to notice him in his superfine blue Georgia clothes? But he's not coy when speaking about the love of his shipboard companion and his sleeping with while instructing the young Mosquito Indian prince on the tenets of Christianity. And I'll now end. Whatever the case might have been, indeed, I doubt whether Hanoverian culture even had a concept of gayness. The fact is that this book we are interrogating here today, White Men's Magic, omits an important discussion of sexuality and gender in the protagonist of the interesting narrative. This omission causes me to ask, what kind of theory is scripturalization that avoids the place of sex and gender in configuring and conjuring power? Thank you.
Well, I guess it's my time. First, I want to say how much I agree with Bobby Hill about the importance of this text. As a matter of fact, I chided Vincent when I learned about this panel, because I thought that this book deserved something on the order of a conference that produced theorizing scripture. I thought that it was a landmark in terms of what I thought Vincent and the Center was about, and therefore should be thoroughly looked at and understood and examined and fussed over and so on by a number of scholars, because I think it's just that important. Nevertheless, I'm glad to be here. And one of the things I liked about it is that Vincent carried out in a book-length manuscript what I once tried to do when I was dealing with the same problem of cargo cults, where the West, in a strange way, and most Westerners don't understand this themselves, but they do it every day, they spiritualize matter. And therefore matter cannot be matter anymore. It's take on the spiritualization. And when a lot of this kind of matter was dumped on the people in New Guinea, they saw it as matter. And that was strange for the Westerners. They looked at the spiritual value of it. But anyway, let me get on with my comments. The title of my comments are "Sticks and Stones May Break My Bones, but Words, ... This aphoristic adage that is the title of my remarks is easily recognized as one of those moralistic admonitions that was repeated by teachers, parents, and almost every adult person in the neighborhood I grew up in. The aim of this word of wisdom was to quell the ire of adolescents who had become upset with the kind of name calling that was rampant at this age in my time. Of course, those in and outside my family were guilty of name calling, what we refer to as calling me out of my name. There was a certain specialty in inventing a very precise name of insult that fitted both the person and the occasion and delivered in the context of an audience of experts in this art. This was the epitome of name calling, and only the proper response to it, and the only proper response to it was violence. Those were fighting words. Our aphorism speaks directly to this point. Our adage defined the terrain of a verbal contest. It specified what counted as real authentic harm, physical violence, and the ephemeral uncomfortableness which was the effect of verbal abuse. Now this aphorism had one meaning within an in-group of family and community. Within this community there was a serious language game. One could play or decline to play and shuffle it all on the effect of being called out of your name, as if it did not matter. But I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and that was always that other community. All too often the community ignored my presence and seldom developed a vocabulary of proper names for members of my community. The adage had another meaning in this context. Almost all their words were meant to serve as sticks and stones. Meanings and gestures and expressions that were intended to harm you, to dehumanize, and make little account of your being in the world. From this point of view, this community, from this point of view of the community, the aphorism can be read as follows. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words are designed to control, dominate, destroy you, and dig up your ancestors and burn their bones. This is, of course, a descriptive statement of an oppressed situation, and the work before us is definitely about this. It is about this and much more. Allow me to get at the much more by looking at one aphorism our aphorism in a different way. It is about the interrelationship of sticks and stones to words. Therein lies the magic. How is it possible for inanimate matter, things rendered silent and or passive, to have the power of word, of speech? And what or who authorizes this power, which may be present in word and speech? Now I want to say something about the white man's magic and the Institute. To get at the substance of the book, I should like to begin where Vincent himself begins in introducing his text to us. I know something about the latter part of this story since I was invited some 2 decades ago to one of the conferences Vincent organized under his African American research project. Let me return to a paraphrase of his own autobiographical narrative. He tells us he was a rather precocious child, maybe born in a veil, who eagerly responded to the learning task of the cultural environment. It was through the exercises of these practices that he ended up at Harvard University, taking a degree in biblical studies. So allow me a little aside at this point, because I think it's important in terms of the way I see the importance of this text. At that time, there were several African American scholars who held doctorates in various theological studies, but very few had taken the doctorate in biblical studies. One could almost count all of them on the fingers of one hand. One of the goals of the Fund for Theological Education, which was heavily influenced at that time by James Cone, Shelby Brooks, K. Roy Wilmore, and me, was to rectify the situation by encouraging and increasing the number of African American biblical scholars. Now, whether Vincent knew about this or not, I don't know, but it doesn't make any difference. Vincent's study in the doctoral program is part of this context. In any case, the nucleus can be found in Vincent's establishment of the African American Bible Research Project when he was at Union Theological Seminary in 1995. This is when I got wind of what he was about. And I must say, I was a bit dubious. First of all, I suspected, since he was a Harvard graduate, he might have embodied several wrong notions about the study of religion from Professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was professor of comparative religions at Harvard. Especially Professor Smith's methodology of scripture bothered me. There was this methodological argument, you have to understand, between the people at Chicago and Harvard. Now, second, at the conference I attended, there were several scholars from a radically wide range of disciplines. There were so many disciplinary positions that I thought that nothing short of chaos could ensue from such an endeavor, because everything seemed to be everything. I'm certain that Vincent was acutely aware of both these kinds of problems. His research to date, and especially this text before us, reveals how brilliantly and creatively he has dealt with the task that he assigned himself. From my perspective, he accomplished this by defining his major methodological approach in terms of hermeneutics. In so doing, the primary issue is to understand what is being presented. This is much easier said than done. The issue is raised immediately when we note that many of his major studies possess an autobiographical introduction. He says, I am a mid-career professional working in a small college town located in one of the world's largest and diverse population center. I am a male, but further and more poignantly defined by being called in this era at least as African American black male. I'm a teacher, scholar of religion, more precisely a teacher scholar of a particular representation of scriptures. The last two listed aspects of my identity, African American male scholar of the New Testament as representative of scripture, are highly charged. The latter category has to do with a phenomenon that has over the centuries clearly been overdetermined in terms of a type of investigation, exegesis, but oddly and curiously rather underdetermined in terms of phenomenology, anthropology, political, and psychosocial criticism of origins, ongoing usages, functions, and effects. The former category, African American black male, has been frighteningly overdetermined as a particular symbol in U.S. and Western culture, but barely recognized as that in which one can encounter the authentically complex, free, singular, even if flawed thinking, speaking, acting subject. And so there we have it set up. He wrote that in Theorizing Scripture. Vincent's language here is similar to the language he used to speak of Equiano's situation in White Men's Magic, where he says, the hero, Equiano, the hero of our adventure is a black person, but being a black is not the chief issue. In plainer terms, the story is about how a formerly enslaved black person comes to call himself African, Christian, and almost an Englishman. About what such transformations of identity mean, what it entails, what is assumed, and what is required, and about what is called scriptures or the Bible as a front catchphrase, abbreviation for historical, ongoing, nearly taken for granted psychosocial, cultural phenomena and dynamics is made to work in the world he experienced, and how such working precipitated his survival and success. Now, from a rather simplistic point of view, only one of the descriptions Equiana mentions the only empirical designation he used was that he was a black man. You could look at him and say, well, he got some color in his skin. Okay? All the other descriptions, African, Christian, English, are ascriptive. They're ascriptive designations. Names, the origin which lies in discursive practices. Issues of this kind confronted Vincent, for he also was a black African scholar, Christian, and we might say almost, but not quite, an American. But like analogous terms in the life of Equiano, what did all this mean? Could he simply take the path of a cultural progressivism, leaving behind the rich complexity of the tradition of his ancestors and proceed into the mode of a tabula rasa, into the future of the American dream via the pursuit of happiness? After all, he had a Harvard degree. Conversely, is it possible to reject everything outside one's tradition? The literatures of the West, the American founding documents, the Bible, and affirm and adhere to the text of only his own tradition, whether in Africa or in Alabama. These options in some combination of them were and even today remain options for many intelligent scholars in various positions. Rather than opt for either of these, Equiano and Vincent, in the words of one of our panelists, Ronne Hartfield, found another way home. Dipesh Chakrabarty's comment concerning the role and necessity for a new form of scholarship stemming from scholars from the traditions that underwent oppression and domination in the modern West has said this: European thought is at once indispensable and inadequate in helping us to deal with the task before us. The West, which is now everybody's heritage and which affects all, may be renewed only from these margins of those who have been oppressed. I had expressed my own view of the situation in Significations when I said the oppressed person or culture must deal with the fictive truth of the status of those who oppress them. That is, their second creation, and discover their own autonomy and truth, their first creation. The locus for this structure is a mystic consciousness, or as someone, as Valorie said, a Creole consciousness, or an improvisational consciousness, which dehistoricizes the relationship for the sake of creating a new form of humanity, a form of humanity that is no longer based upon the master-slave dialectic. Now, I want to say something about the meaning of Equiano, Ronnie Hartfield has already talked about his painting, I guess, at the front piece of his text, and we're talking about a book. It's a book, but also implicated in his book is the other book, which is the Bible. But we also need to talk about his being an enslaved person. Because Vincent speaks about the fetishization of the Bible. And I wish he had gone into that a bit more. Because the fetish and slavery go together, and African slavery go together. The fetish arises out of African slavery. The fetish begins on the west coast of Africa. In those factories where slaves were brought from the interior and held there until they were get a boat to ship them across. And in these factories were run by all kind of funny people. Some crazy Europeans, some people who had escaped from African cultures because they had been accused of some crime and didn't want to stay in their own culture. Some renegade Muslims, some renegade Christians, all a polyglot of funny people ran these factories. And within these factories, the word factory itself coming from the Latin word to make, you know, facere, and in the factories, and it was the first use of that term factory, was the place where you made slaves. And in these factories, the language of the fetish emerged because these people who ran these factories would ask some of the natives of that area, what is that you have around your neck? Or who is your God? And they would say, oh my God, it's this, you know, I swear by this, or whatever. And they would say, oh my God, he's got a God. But they look at it carefully and say, it's gold. It's gold, that's gold, he doesn't know. And so they would say, will you trade? You know, we have some trinkets here, we trade that. And so they brought on this notion that their gods are humanly made gods. Oh my God. Well, let me finish.
Yeah, don't stop him.
No, I'm gonna finish because everybody's been nice. I left my paper, you see. I had two more sections. One was on the fetish and the relationship of the fetish as a portable meaning of value, and the Bible also as a portable carrying a portable meaning of value, and then his Equiano, who is in the Atlantic, and we don't know, he doesn't know who he is or why he is, a Christian or African or whatever. The other thing I wanted to talk about was a writing lesson. Ronnie Hartfield had mentioned Derrida. I was going to mention Derrida's argument with Levi-Strauss over a scene of writing and the relationship of writing to violence. And I was going to get into that, but not too far. And I was going to accuse them of a wonderful argument and, you know, about logocentrism and all that, but neither one of them, both of them from the Jewish tradition, ever spoke about why are you in South America? Derrida never mentions the trouble in Algiers where he came from. See? And so we have this great big abstract argument about writing, but they don't want to talk about the specificities that involve them in having this abstract argument about philosophical matters. And then finally I was going to talk about Another Way Home, which was how Equiano and how a lot of us, if we take this seriously, have to undertake how to get back home. Home, what home means now. Okay, but I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Benny Liew. We said a few words about you earlier, but I wanted to create space. We're glad that you got here safely.
Thank you. I need to find a way home.
Would you like to share some words with us?
You want me to do it now?
Yes.
Sorry for being late. It's not my intention, but no control over it. I want to thank Professor Wimbush, first of all, for this wonderful book on Equiano and the early transcontinental and cross-racial contact of the 18th century, especially about how white English folk may believe and a black stranger like Equiano may do with, in Spivak's terminology, the welding that white folk in Britain did with and through scripturalization. This dynamic reminds me of Alfred Gell's argument in Art and Agency, that the social processes around art objects are basically unpredictable. So the so-called artist and recipient may change place and take turn in taking the active role. Gell, interestingly enough, describes this distributed and contingent agency as abduction. Though Gell is referring to logics and thus abduction as hypothetical inference of meaning that is not yet provable or established, abduction brings more readily to most minds capture or enslavement, which is precisely what Equiano and numerous blacks had to suffer in an uneven power structure. As Wimbush argues in this book, an uneven power structure that allow or enable abduction of blacks does not mean that blacks are not able to abduct agency back and forth with even their captors and or enslavers. The 18th century was also the time when modern critical study or historical criticism of the Bible started. Historical criticism is known for cutting up the Bible, to identify first the written sources and then the oral traditions behind the biblical text, for the goal of ensuring or ascertaining an objective or original meaning. While Equiano's book predated these early developments in modern biblical scholarship, his life as a captive, thus experience of being cut apart, as well as his use of the Bible, a very selective emphasis of parts, especially Luke and Acts, clearly show that parts, partials, and partitions often do develop lives of their own, and meanings are not dependable on or controllable by roots, origins, or originals. This relates to not only adopting agency, but also Wimbush's emphasis on dislocating the critical study of the Bible from the narrow professionalization and hence epistemic foreclosures of the academy. Wimbush's reading of Equiano beyond disciplinary boundary and simple memetics also reminds me of how readings of Eric Auerbach's Mimesis have long missed or dismissed the place of the Bible in that otherwise revered tome in the larger world of literary studies, because of definite disciplinary divisions. Auerbach, as Said points out, wrote Mimesis as an estranged exile in Istanbul. What Said fails to point to, despite calling Mimesis the finest description we have of the millennial effects of Christianity on literary representation, is how the book actually demonstrates Wimbush's goal of moving critical study of the Bible from historical criticism to critical history, and thus cutting it loose from traditional biblical studies in particular, and even religious studies in general. Beginning by contrasting pagan and Judeo-Christian literary traditions, and then representing the latter as the beginning of the subsequent literary canon of the West. Auerbach's Mimesis not only situates the Bible in a particular literary history, but also presents the Bible as itself being imitated, copied, dispersed, dissimulated, and displaced, not replaced, however, by writers like Dante, Rabelais, Shakespeare, Flaubert, Woolf, and Proust. One does not have to agree with Auerbach's choice of writers or his sole focus on Europe to see the validity and significance of Wimbush's project. I do not refer to Gell and Auerbach to validate Wimbush's work with the work of white scholars, but to underscore how Wimbush's book contains a wealth of resources to think with. Having said this, let me raise three main questions regarding Wimbush's reading of Equiano. First, Wimbush makes repeated references to how Equiano begins his story with the power of priests, magicians, and wise men over a superstitious and credulous people in his homeland. Given Wimbush's reading that this beginning is part of Equiano's set up to argue for the similarities between the British and the Oyibo people, it would be logical to read this reference as not only designating British scripturalization through the Bible as white man's magic, but also declaring the British people as equally superstitious and credulous. If so, keeping in mind Jael's abducting agency, one may read these two peoples as comparable and hence competitive rivals. Both, for instance, see themselves and claim themselves to be the modern counterparts of biblical Jews. As comparable and hence competitive rivals, the captive Equiano might desire to become an Englishman by acquiring literacy in general and biblical literacy in particular. But the Englishman might also be so captivated by something that the Oyibo person had that the white man resorted to violent enslavement. Similar to the double meaning of abduction I mentioned through Jael, what I'm getting at is a link between captivation and captivity that is no longer one-directional. So captivation might be a cause as well as an effect of captivity. Renato Rosado, to whom Wimbush also refers in his book, is known for what he calls imperial nostalgia, or the irony that a colonizer may lament and desire a lost object that the colonizer himself has destroyed, like an element of a native culture. My reading through Equiano here would render Rosado's concept more circular and dynamic. A colonizer does not just desire something native after he has destroyed it. His desire for something also causes him to commit a destructive act against the native in order to possess what belongs to the native. If the Bible is a white man's fetish and the fetish represents simultaneously a lack and is covering over, does my reading here not help nuance that lack on the part of the white man? Second, I'm not clear if Wimbush sees whites or fellow blacks as Equiano's main target audience. On the one hand, Wimbush's statement that most blacks in 18th century Britain were unable to read English scripts would suggest the former. In fact, Wimbush writes rather definitively at one point that Equiano's readership demographics, as reflected in the list of subscribers to his book, was mostly entirely white persons of considerable means, and another that black people in mass were partly presumed to be the readers of Equiano's story. On the other hand, Wimbush's provocative proposal to read Equiano's story as a black man's ethnography on a white world would imply that Equiano, as most ethnographers do, was writing mainly for and to his own people. In fact, squeezed between the pages of those two definitive statements about Equiano writing to a white audience, Wimbush reads Equiano's narrative about his conversion and his visit to a free school for blacks in Philadelphia as winks and nods to Equiano's fellow blacks, that black converts would radically reshape God's political economy of salvation, and that they should school themselves to implement that reshaping. This tension is what interests me. Why this insistence on Wimbush's part that Equiano was not only calling on whites to school more blacks? One easy, perhaps too easy response to this, given Wimbush's point, that Equiano's story bridges black converts and white English to form a diaspora of African Christians, is that Equiano was writing to both blacks and whites. This, however, points to my next question. In addition to asking to whom Equiano was writing, I want to ask Wimbush what he thinks Equiano had become in this story of self-creation and community creation to call forth a new we of African Christians in Britain. There are several places that Wimbush seems to let go or let pass too easily, especially Equiano's own reference to accompanying and helping a Dr. Irving to select and purchase slaves in Jamaica for a plantation. The difference between this and Equiano's attempt to rescue, in whiteface no less, a recaptured freeman called Annis, betrays a profound ambivalence that Equiano might have about his fellow blacks. This, coupled with how Equiano sees himself as an almost white Columbus, and Mosquito Indians as poor and innocent people who mistreat their wives and women, even though public interpreters of scripture in Equiano's own story are exclusively male, should lead one to ask if and how Equiano's leveling, crossing, and breaching involve simultaneously a differentiation, division, and separation. His Sons of Africa, or School of African Christians, sound like the school of rhetoric that Isocrates started in Athens in the 4th century BCE. Believing that Greek superiority is an educational rather than a born or inherent category, Isocrates taught that all persons could be, should be, need to be schooled to become Greek and move out of their inferiority. Going back to my earlier point, the captivation that comes after captivity may also make one complicit, and the enchantment effect of enslavement may itself be an additional entrapment. If the Bible, as Wimbush argues, is both the white man's magic and fetish, it's the African Christian who can talk back to the Bible in Britain, becoming Equiano's fetish and salvation. Is this brotherhood only sons and men, limited to and contingent on conversion to Christianity, literacy in general, and biblical literacy in particular? Isn't this bond with Englishmen, by being almost an Englishman, also a bondage, since the promise of participation is premised on turning oneself into another? My point of concern here is not to play the blame game, but to think again about Frantz Fanon's statements in Black Skin, White Mask, that educated blacks would consistently be tempted to stop considering themselves genuine Negroes. The Negro is savage, whereas the student is civilized. You are us, and if anyone thinks you are a Negro, he is mistaken, because you merely look like one. Can Wimbush honestly say that becoming someone other than a poor African did not alien Equiano from other Africans? This might offend my own sense of ethics and commitment, but can I honestly say that becoming an educated person of color with a PhD does not alien me from uneducated or less educated persons of color? Part of my response to that question must involve, I think, an investigation of our academic discipline as an institution. Wimbush has also started doing this in his largely autobiographical prologue. But let me close by quoting from Alfred North Whitehead, so we can get a further sense of how big this challenge really is. And I quote, "The professionalization of knowledge is exclusive and intolerant, and rightly so. It fixes attention on a definite group of abstractions, neglects everything else, and elicits every scrap of information and theory which is relevant to what it has retained. This method is triumphant, provided that the abstractions are judicious. But however triumphant, the triumph is within limits. The neglect of these limits leads to disastrous oversights. Acknowledging our discipline as an institution enables us to understand its difficulty with interdisciplinary pursuits, because such pursuits challenge and violate its premise on isolating a turf and hence controlling its borders." Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Yes, most definitely. Why don't we open this up for group discussion for maybe the next 15 minutes. And our panelists can also chime in on this discussion as well. Would anyone in the audience like to begin?
I want to respond to something that Bobby Hill said. I tried reading Equiano several times on my own, along with, but I couldn't get through it. But it didn't interest me enough. But I said, this is, whatever. And so part of the reason I'm glad is that I can now read Equiano, because it's not one of those things that jump at you, it didn't do anything for me before. But I think that one of the issues that Bobby raised was the issue of those students. What's the validity of that kind of criticism? See, because there are several places where you can make it in Equiano, And being I used to be an Africanist, and I knew all about the Igbos and the Yorubas and so on. And there's something very peculiar here going on, because with the Igbos, the Igbos who were colonized, and the Yorubas who were colonized, and so on, and the British liked the Igbos much better. I put it that way. And so there's some kind of problematic here in terms of the kind of resistance that people may have in reading Equiano in our time, especially. You know?
Would anyone else like to add to that or raise another
Well,
issue or question?
I have a lot of notes here. So I'd like to put a couple of responses to particularly your statements and Dr. Hill's statements, which in a sense presuppose what you call a mask, a white mask on a black person, what you call an impostership. And my own perspective on that is that neither of those two terms actually respects the complexity of the predicament of black people in wider white culture. There's a kind of simplistic mode right now, though diminishing in the last few years, for black students in poverty black schools who are trying to do well so they can get into college. And the term flung at them is, you're trying to be white. And the students have to live with that opprobrium, which is rooted in a false equation of hard work and intellectual activity or commitment with being white. And my own perspective is that mostly black people in America are misread as they take on various layers of the larger society as putting on a white mask. I mean, Jean Genet's play on that is a perfect example of that to me. To assume that somebody like Vincent, who goes through all the best white schools and learns the language and the scriptures, is then putting on a white mask, is a misunderstanding, I think, and a misreading, so that I don't look at that assimilate predicament that most of the people in this room represent as impostership. In the same way, I think there's such a, particularly for black people, such a deep awareness of the connection to one's roots, to one's black roots. You may not know where you come from in Africa, mostly we don't, but we know we come from there. Sometime, somewhere in the last few centuries. And there are residuals of that emerge in the music and dance and the way people go to church and the way people try to raise their children and all of that. So there's a very deep connection even among some of the black people I knew. If I said to them, well, that's like Africa, they would say, that's not like Africa. Don't tell me that's like Africa, because their ideas about Africa were Tarzan, right? You know, and they didn't learn until later in the 20th century to valorize whatever the many meanings of Africa are. So I just wanted us to take a second look at what you call the first creation and the second creation and so forth, that for me, everybody in America is a multi-layered person the second they put their feet on this land. And for black people, the layers are much more complicated than they are for others because they immediately inhabit slapped in the face with what racism and all the implications of that. And I have a lot of conversations with my friends whose roots are in Eastern Europe, for example, often Jewish, and they say, oh, our predicament is the same. It's the same thing. It's not. It is not the same. And those layers are much more complicated. They're just much more multiple. And so I think that Equiano, it made me sad to hear about these students who looked on him as some kind of traitor. I guess that'd be the word I'd use. And it reminded me, at one point, one of the classes I taught, I was teaching literature of Africa and the Caribbean and South America. And one of my black students came up to me at the end of a couple of classes and she said, I just have to tell you that I don't think you should be putting all our stuff out there. You shouldn't be putting our stuff out there. And we had it was a wonderful teachable opportunity to talk about how everybody ought to be putting their stuff out there. And I hoped in this class that's what we'd be doing, and ultimately in the class that's what we end up doing. But her anxiety about it was precisely connected to this sense that there was something vulnerable, more vulnerable, an additional layer of vulnerability in being black because of racism in this society. And she was right. I had to say that to her. That's absolutely true. And so that's one point I wanted to make.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
I actually am in complete agreement. But I think one has to remember, first of all, that Fanon wrote decades ago. So all this question about authenticity and is there a core, he was before all of that.
Yes.
So I do agree the whole language about mask and skin, but the same applies to your language of multi-layered, I think, because it still implies there's a core. We are complex being. It's not like an onion, you peel out the layer and there's the real you. So that's not what I'm getting at when I refer to that book. I hope I was clear when I earlier said that Equiano actually showed that the original doesn't dictate meanings.
Yes.
Life has its own development. So
Yes.
I'm all for that. I'm getting at two things. The first thing is, however we develop, do we develop in a way that we begin to look at people of color, maybe it is, I would just say other Asians, with a particular standard in mind. That because I have developed, maybe I should not even use the word develop, because I've learned and become like this is now a standard. If you have not developed or become like me, or learn like me, then you are somewhat less than what it should be. So that's the first thing that I want to question. The second thing is actually more difficult. I think is the question whether I can honestly admit to myself, because of the education I have, because I've left Asia, because I've lived in Canada and the US and wherever, and New Zealand and all those places, can I still pretend that I'm just like an Asian who is working in a factory? I would love to think that, because that's my ethics, that's my commitment, that I love to say, you and I, we're still fighting oppression or something. But I don't think that is honest.
Well, of course. I mean, the question you raise is a profound one. On the other hand, I think of my own father, who worked in a factory his whole life. And he was happy that his children didn't have to do that. But it never occurred to him or to his children that we were much other than him. We were not other. We simply had added some things that weren't available to him. On the other hand, we respected the fact he knew some things that we didn't know. He did. He was raised in the country. He knew his father was a slave, was born a slave, was a slave till he was 15 years old. And he knew some stuff about that that we didn't know. And so there's a kind of reciprocality rather than an apology for what one grows or adds. And it is adding. But you can't just think you add it and therefore that's better.
Oh, I agree. I'm saying we're
So
tempted
as long as you
to
know,
go that way.
as long as you know that, then you're okay. You know, you can't be like people in Asia. That would be totally dishonest. And you can't be, in some regards, like uneducated people. That would be totally dishonest too. We have to recognize that there are levels of humanity that are consonant. They just have different efflorescences. And as long as you kind of know that, you're okay. I knew, I had a Puerto Rican student once whose mother and father did not want her to read books, the books that I was assigning her, because I talked to the mother and she said, they will take her away from us. She was terrified that they would take her away. And so I had to then kind of work with the mother to get her to see that they weren't going to take her away, that they were going to move her in some ways to a place that would be harder for them to share. But that would give her more perspective on her mother and her father and Puerto Rico and all that. So that's just one point. I want to make one other point, which is you raised, Bobby, a very sort of funny question about whether Equiano might have been gay based on his dandyism. And it struck me that there's still a lot of that going on. The men who like to dress up and wear pink shirts and so on there, but not at that point in the 18th century. You know, men like Thomas Jefferson, enormous womanizers, spent hours just putting on his clothes in the morning, more than his wife did. That was the way he was. You got a country guy like John Adams who never wore a tie and didn't know how to tie one, but he sent his son to school and turned out his son perfect, accoutered like Thomas Jefferson. He could laugh about Thomas Jefferson, but he wanted his son to be on that stage.
But there's a difference in Hanover, England at the time. You see, all these clubs and whatever that's going on there, you see, so that we're not talking about a Virginia plantation.
Right.
You see, so it's quite a different setting in which you place this, and of course, Equiano wasn't the only one wearing these dandy clothes. There was a whole bunch of people there wearing these dandy clothes and so on. And these upper class clubs for men was,
Things went on. Things went on.
So things went on.
They still do, but you don't call them gay.
I know, but
I mean,
what I'm saying is that
I actually have a question about that, because you had brought that up, and I was wondering if there's a sense in which the attempt to stabilize Equiano in that way, as labeling him from his native land as an imposter, which sort of implies kind of a stable self, or describing him as homosexual, is a way in which sort of the argument in White Man's Magic is seeking to complicate, that it's an effort to localize something that is essentially by its nature constructed.
You want to say something?
Well, I do agree with that. I mean, I think that that's pretty much where I want to stand. I think it's quite poignant, this revisiting of the class, was so powerful in my own memory, and I think in many ways it's ongoing. And I would say that the problem that I detected with most of the students had to do precisely with the anxiety around the lack of stable identity that Equiano projected. And that's an old and ongoing problem, named most brilliantly, most recently in the long view of things, by Ellison. It goes on and on and on. And the language about being almost this, almost the other, almost Englishman, names that lack of stability. And that has, in his own time, certainly since his time, been considered quite threatening. And so he's a particular kind of, I think the reason a lot of people can't get through it is because then what is the thing he's forcing you to grab hold of? That kind of thick blackness that's obviously male inflected, and that remains a problem. I think he's a window of opportunity for us to learn about the politics of construction. Right. That it's ongoing. And that it's fraught with some danger, but all sorts of possibilities. So therefore I see this, if you want to connect him to the single form of identity, he's going to disappoint. And I think whatever the complexities of the construction of the text, I need to be quite clear that I'm uninterested so much in the historical Equiano, whether he, like Jesus, was married in this way, but whether what he forces us to acknowledge as the ongoing and sort of universal challenge, that is, the way I would put it, is that all of us have to figure out how we know, not first what is to be known, but how we know in this situation. Know things, know reality and the like. What in this situation is the trick, the regime, the arrangement by which you can know, which is understood as power. And it's a window onto one man's discovery of the way to know in that situation. Now, the way to know is going to change from situation to situation. But for his situation, how to know? How do you know? And this is what he found out and performed it. And so would be considered in that situation threatening because of that kind of discovery. I think there's plenty of room to see that as a kind of breakthrough and a lesson to be learned, apart from all of the other dangers which he clearly fell into. Because you don't want to see him as mirroring the kind of perfect reflection of anything in particular, but it kind of names what is the most significant problem or challenge. How to know what is to be known in this situation.
Could I
We
say
have-
something?
And we just said we have 1 minute left, and I just want to honor our time.
With all due respect, you're starting from an assumption that Equiano is really just a vector of some deeper underlying question, and that an examination of Equiano will dredge up, will allow us to retrieve this problematic. I believe that any such approach, starting from that premise, is deeply flawed. I also think that the problem we face with Equiano today is his canonical status. He is the most canonical author in the canon of black literature. And when I look at that and realize how he has been fixed in this status, we lose all contact with the real Equiano. And what I'm trying to do is to topple him, bring him down from that plinth that he's sitting on, and say, look, talk to us. What? Tell us if we can, get at some of these strange origins or your behaviors. He becomes far more interesting and non-reductive. It's the reductive Equiano that I think stultifies.
So your argument is the canonization of Equiano, and
that's
not
one
so
of
much
the
Equiano per se.
That's right. That's right. And I love the guy. I think he is a West Indian Anansi, trickster. He is quintessential Creole.
Exactly.
At large in the Western world, and I love this mixture. So now let's deal with the brother down here, and this looking to Equiano as somehow this sacred figure, this fixed
Well, see,
entity.
I just think that's a misreading of what I'm trying to do here.
No, I was saying that his positioning of Equiano reminded me of the canonicity. Your reading of Equiano, I think, is based on a different problematic. One in which, as I say, you make Equiano the vector, of this enterprise called Western civilization. And I think we have to think about the risks involved, where Equiano simply gets to play the role of vector in this. Let's get to Equiano and let the other stuff arise inductively.
Would you like to say a last few formal words so we can continue the conversation?
I really appreciate it. I understand we're out of time here. I want to mention, I've already broached this subject. So no artist or writer, can obviously determine how you read their works, and I certainly don't want to do that. That's a losing game. So I appreciate the dynamics of this kind of conversation, some very powerful arguments that were put on the table. I do want to say quite very briefly that it occurred to me that maybe the most important thing to say at this point, at least to begin to talk about and sort of represent, are some of the pretextual problems and challenges that led to the text, obviously. The one I've named already briefly, something like the complexity of anxiety, but also something like ascesis and ecstatics of identity. That's one of the reasons Equiano remains powerful, poignant, important to me. You all have referenced the class in Cleveland. I should reference another friend just briefly who is Ghanaian, and his early response was an emphatic no to me, to the very idea of suggesting some poignant beginnings in that early modern period as a way to find a self, complex self in that period. No, he says, your roots are much different, much older, much deeper, African, more than the humiliation that represents the slave status. And I found that, and he was just very, very emotional about that, and I found that that is a kind of response that clearly needs to be taken quite seriously, but we also need to understand what assumptions he's bringing to the reading of Equiano, my reading of Equiano and of Equiano, and the history of that kind of response. And I relate it in a sense to the interpretations of the class I referenced before. That is to say, it's important somehow to transcend the kind of problematics that are inherent in an Equiano being located anywhere in the Black Atlantic world. We can negotiate theories about whether that should be South Carolina or Jamaica. Second, the kind of fear and also joy of solitariness. That is to say, coming to the problematic of making of a self represents accepting a kind of threat, a kind of an assault. And one thinks right away, if you want to think about Douglas, about the importance of this kind of work in relationship to the politics and psychology of runaways, of the Maroons, of marriage. And then once having decided that there is no stable self and you have to work on it, right, negotiate it and the like, there is both the fear and the joy of the solitariness in psychocultural intellectual marriage and the like. So the question before, who am I who thinks and argues and writes? Here you have the question, for whom? What do I think and argue and write? You argue with and against the Afrocentrists or academic, the ones on 125th Street, popular ideologues, this field house, the great house farm that is the academy and the guild. For whom does one write, or is sustained sort of departure in a site of marriage part of the writing? And then lastly, the dread and delight of going the long distance, of continuing to argue, to think, to write in this vein. Here my encounter, the last one would be sort of clearly my mother on ongoing terms, although she mainly wants to make sure everybody buys the book. But she says, along with a friend I've known for almost 40 years, a kind of surrogate mother, the first response is, I don't really understand what you're saying, or even trying to say. And that brings up the challenge that you often hear, it must be made plain, kept plain. And so it often has the force of pulling one back from that site of solitariness or marriage, back onto the plain field, or maybe back to the great house farm, something like that. And then with the effort to explain what's going on, yes, that makes some sense. That sounds like this and the other. And so it raises the question at once whether staying in that place of aloneness is worth it, or whether the ancestors, the ones who have haunted all along, were already there and are thereby beckoning me to continue this route to meet them on other terms. These are just some of the pretextual issues and challenges that serve as a kind of backstory, if you will, for the book. I cannot tell you what it is about. I think you are to determine what it can mean for you. I would like to make sure that we remain in conversation about the issues broached, put on the table. Hopefully we'll continue to stay in conversation about what I think is certainly one of the driving issues. What can be known? How do we know it? And assuming that knowing represents power, how that is to be used in terms of the continuing construction of a whole self. May I just express my profound thanks to all of you for what you have given me this day and over the years, some of you as friends and colleagues. I appreciate the time, you've given the frustrating time, just getting here often. But this is a really powerful moment for us here. It is an effort to make a statement about ISS as a safe and encouraging space to think in this key. And I hope that students understand it that way and are very much encouraged to continue to work at this level and to this depth. Thank you all very much.
Great.